First of all, Mark, it's a privilege to have you here. You are the inaugural guest to this series, and the series is called 10 Questions in 10 Minutes. And I cheat a little. There are two questions at the end. If you care to answer, we answer. And after that, if there's any other topic that you want to talk about, that'd be great. If I can introduce myself really briefly, I think the best way I can put what I do is the way my daughter expressed it. And she said that I help companies that help kids with autism, more specifically in an operational slash strategic point of view. And that is the bent of this conversation as well. It's more operational. And I say that with a little amount of care because I totally understand that because we're in healthcare, there's always an ethical nuance out here. So anyway, my name is Rohit Verma. Mark Shalvarjian, welcome. I've known you for more than 5 years, and you are now the CEO of Gracent. In your opinion, do you think a CEO is better served coming from outside or an internal ABA person? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure.
And you're right, I am from outside. Although I do have a lot of healthcare experience, I have over 25 years working in various slices of healthcare. And so I think the outside perspective can be incredibly valuable from the standpoint of seeing how other healthcare operations operate in more sophisticated and mature slices of healthcare. And so there's value in that. However, I often wish I came from within the field, and I've seen some CEOs who are from within the field and have a lot of experience and are very effective because they really understand sort of the nuances to everything that we do in this field, both clinically and operationally. What I think the gating factor is the quality of the individual who is in the leadership role and what they bring in terms of sophistication, general business sophistication, as well as clinical awareness and understanding of what the ultimate objective is that we're trying to achieve. So I think that it is possible that somebody from within the industry who is purely focused on financial outcomes and perhaps an exit that's going to maximize their value could actually be a bad thing, whereas somebody from outside the industry that brings in a greater awareness of the importance of compliance, for instance, or clinical quality in general, and training programs, and has sophistication in a number of different areas in healthcare in general, could be a real asset to an ABA provider organization that otherwise has a less experienced and mature operating. As a business person, I think that my 20 plus years of just learning from clinicians and learning about the business and sort of the journey of the patient had really benefited me when I moved into behavioral health.
So push comes to shove, if you were to choose, would you choose A or B? So from outside ABA or from within, or you think it's too nuanced to actually you rather be looking?
Because I'm from outside ABA, and I think I bring a different perspective, a different experience set, I would say that having a little more of that broader view of healthcare in general, I think it has served our organization well. I'd like to think that it's served us well. And I think that as you look at many of the larger, the faster growing ABA providers, I think a lot of them are led by healthcare executives that didn't start in ABA. And there are one or two very sort of obvious examples. There are some larger organizations that have been led by people from within the field. And so I don't think it has to be somebody exclusively from outside, but on balance, I think that it's not a bad place to look.
Got it. Okay, thank you. So the next question is a little complicated, but you have the options in front of you. I'm going to read them out. And the idea here is that you're a CEO, important for you to know the pulse of the organization. And if you were to choose three metrics, what would they be? And I give you, I think, 7, and then there's others that you might just decide. So the ones that I give are reimbursement rate, the bill pay spread, so reimbursement rate compared to wage rates or wage costs, the supervision percentage, BT productivity, sometimes referred to as BT utilization, supervisor productivity or utilization, and then the staffing ratio. So if you think in terms of a pyramid with a clinical director on leading the pyramid and having BCBAs reporting to them, supervisors reporting to them, that ratio. or something else entirely? If you were to choose your top three, would they come from this list? Or are they some entirely different?
So my number one would be delivered hours of care, clinical hours of care relative to recommended hours of care. It's not on your list, but it's really a measure of, I think, of clinical appropriateness and delivering the care that the child needs
Yeah.
in order to be able to make progress. And so that's the one measure that I look at more closely than anything else. Reimbursement rate is a close second. And along with that, bill pay spread, generating reasonable gross margins, I think is super, super important from an economic standpoint. And then you have three different metrics that all really relate to productivity, which
Hmm.
is really important as well. I think from both a quality perspective, a turnover perspective. For instance, the amount of time that BCBA spends supervising and interacting with BTs can directly impact the turnover rate of those roles, the RBT and the BT roles. And so I want that level of supervision to be as high as possible. I want those folks to be as productive as they possibly can be. But a lot of that productive time really should be in coaching and mentoring and ensuring that the RBTs are feeling comfortable with what they're doing and the way that they're managing and work, providing the one-on-one therapy with children. And then the RBT's productivity really needs to be at a very high level in order to make the economic equation work. And I think everybody understands that. So I think what's pretty standard these days seems to be around 90% productivity or greater. So
Wow.
I think that's a reasonable expectation. And I think
So,
that's something we watch
so
carefully.
question number three, when you think in terms of your growth strategy, any preference for de novo versus acquisition?
Preferences on de novos, that the rates of return on de novos can greatly exceed returns on acquisitions. I think that from a cultural standpoint, from an integration and kind of building it and keeping the culture the way you want it to be, easier with de novos than in an acquisition situation where you're bringing on people with perhaps different ways of thinking, different ways of doing things historically, and some resistance to change, which is not uncommon. So de novo.
De novo. Service model, center-based, home-based, or hybrid? Actually, is Gracent just center-based? I'm curious.
Yeah, we're
Okay.
we're over 95% center based. We do a
And
little bit of
that's
home-based care prior to opening new centers so that
got
we
it.
get kids started and then we transition them into centers. So very low percentage of home-based.
Definitely by choice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the thinking behind that?
I've worked in both environments. The one thing that I recognize very quickly when looking at center-based care versus home-based care is that the percentage of recommended hours or authorized hours that get delivered in centers tends to be much greater than delivered in homes. I think the cancellation rates tend to
Mhm.
be much lower in centers. Again, my observation. The the building a culture where people feel like they're part of a community within a center, I think really is superior to home-based care where a provider may be one-on-one with the child for up to 8 hours a day and they
Right.
don't have a team around them. And in fact, if they have a particularly difficult client, they can't work with that client for 2 or 3 hours and then transition to another room with somebody who's much easier. There's less balance potentially in their day unless you're bringing in multiple providers. I think the travel time and the lost efficiency by moving part-time providers or full-time providers between part-time clients, you don't really lose the efficiency in the center as much as you may in a home-based model. While you're paying for rent and you have some additional expenses by being in a fixed location, I do feel like it is the superior place to base operations. I think the other side that I would say that is a good argument for home-based care is that it's a child's natural environment. And so I think if you're providing center-based care, getting the kids out, working with the family in a natural environment in a very intentional way is beneficial. And so we try to do that when we can in our current operations.
This is a simple kind of yes, no kind of question. School. where do you stand with that? Yes to schools or no to schools?
We don't operate in schools, but it's something I'm really interested in continuing to explore and figure out a way to do it economically.
Yeah.
Interested, but
Yeah. So if the reimbursement rates are fine, right? Obviously, if you can check that box, that was like number two in your top three, right? If you can check that box, and if you can solve summer challenge, it's a very clean model. It feels like a center. You know what I mean? Easy to schedule, full-time days. Uh,
agreed. And if you can
so
continue services through the summer, uh,
yeah,
then it really makes sense.
that really makes sense. Exactly.
You don't
So
have, yeah.
so interested. I'm gonna put you as a yes.
Put me as very interested and along the lines of block scheduling, anxious to move
Yeah,
that direction. Yeah,
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 nice. On the de novo planning, and I think you're mostly in urban, semi-urban areas.
right.
Presumably that's by choice. And so what's if that is indeed the case, you're thinking between opening a center in an urban, semi-urban area versus something less urban or rural.
I'm actually very interested in getting into underserved areas more. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
the urban areas and especially the upper middle class, more affluent urban areas are saturated with providers. Frankly, it's where a lot of BCBAs want to live, and they want to live in those areas. And it's the insurance, the reimbursement may be a little bit better, or the number of families with decent insurance that can be served. But I'm very interested in getting to the outlying areas where there are fewer options, and frankly, where there may be less competition
Mm-hmm.
and more of a supply demand gap. So I don't think that there's a supply demand imbalance in every market. I think that
Mm-hmm.
the urban areas or the suburban areas, especially the more affluent suburban areas, are perfectly well supplied with providers. I think when you get out of those areas and you start moving into less densely populated areas, that's where there's real opportunity and frankly where there's real need. I would love to figure out how to expand into densely populated urban areas with lower income demographics in a profitable way. We're not there yet, especially in Illinois and Texas. It's just the way that the Medicaid reimbursement structure is in those states, but
Right.
it's something that we continue to look at and explore.
And so when you talk about the more rural areas and expanding there, would that be a first for you, or do you have a chunk of centers that are in the more rural areas and therefore good comparison points,
It would be a first for us. Yeah,
but you're actively looking?
that's right. That's
Got it.
right.
Got
So it needs to be a little bit of a hybrid supervision model.
it. And then on location itself, are you a believer if you, let's say, are in an urban area and can, the market can tolerate flooding the zone, or is your preference to have centers pretty far away from each other because there might be some cannibalism going on?
Yeah, I think things have changed a lot even in the last 5 years. And whereas a number of providers operate very large centers, anywhere from say 10 to
Hmm.
20,000 square feet, and I think the thinking was back when those centers were built was that there wasn't a lot of competition and families would drive long distances to be able
Right.
to get their kids into ABA. Now, my feeling is that smaller centers closer to where people live and but conveniently located makes a lot more sense. I guess flooding the zone is more our approach. I'd rather have 10 centers all within a 15 or 20-minute drive of one another than have,
Right.
3 or 4 centers covering that same geography. But my 10 centers are going to be more in the 4 to 6,000 square foot range rather than
Hmm.
triple that size.
Yeah. And I just generally believe there's a lot of goodness in proximity.
Yeah,
If you have a good reputation from the point of view of referrals, opening a center nearby, which is going to help. If you have a good reputation for hiring, that's going to be helpful. You also have the opportunity of leveraging management a little bit more to help out with centers that are nearby versus far away.
agreed. So that also leads to, okay, how are you designing the center? Are you designing it just for ABA, or are you also designing spaces where you can provide speech and OT services? And are you going to have the right equipment for OT in particular, other other services beyond ABA?
So that's a good segue to maybe that question, but just before that, just a really quick comment. I was looking at ABC in the Dallas area, this was maybe a
Mhm.
year ago, and they had, I think then 49 centers in the Dallas area.
Yeah, they flooded the
And
zone.
yeah, they definitely flooded the zone. And 80% of them were within 6 miles of the next closest center.
Yeah,
So they're strong believers in that. So
yeah.
this is an interesting point. So you mentioned OT speech. And so are you a believer in a multifunctional service or maybe more pure ABA?
Big believer in interdisciplinary care. So we have ABA, speech, and OT in almost all of our centers. We
Mhm.
also have mental health and physical therapy in a few of our centers. So we provide a broad range of services that we think are beneficial to children with ABA. I think the one that is probably fits in least is that physical therapy piece. OT, speech, and mental health are really important offerings, I think, for the children, for the families that we serve. So I'm a huge proponent of it. In fact, I like to think of our organization as a pediatric therapy company as opposed to an ABA therapy company. I would like for our revenue mix to be maybe two-thirds ABA and one-third all other. Right now, we're not quite there, but we're trying to move that direction. So definitely want to provide all the wraparound services that the children need.
Got it. It's a complicated model though, right?
From a scheduling perspective, it becomes that's where it gets really complicated.
Right.
It also is a little bit challenging in terms of the age of the kids and when they show up. So we end up with a lot of speech and OT sessions and mental health, like later in the afternoon and evening hours for kids who are school age. So we provide services to children who are up to call it mid-teens, but certainly into adolescence. I would say the vast majority of the children that we serve are between the ages of 2 and 12. And even within that, it probably skews more towards 2 to 8, 7 or 8. But we don't discharge children when they hit 7 or 8
Right.
years old, like some early intervention providers do. So what that means though is that we end up with a lot of those kind of wraparound services being delivered in the afternoon. And it can be frenetic when you have
Mhm.
older children who are autistic that need speech, OT, and ABA sort of all within the same block of time, the same 4 hour block from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. So it's challenging, but it's
Is
really
there, yeah, and because I think that like obviously even in ABA, we have to be at least somewhat disciplined with regard to staffing ratios, let's say.
right.
And now this is adding additional degrees of flexibility to manage around. And what I tell people is that at least make sure that your operations in ABA are going well, that you've got a good handle on them before expanding. Just kind of the way I think about it, because like it's complicated anyway. And then if you don't have a good handle on that, be careful or expand with caution. But if you have a good handle, then of course, I can obviously there's lots of benefits from.
It's a really good point, Rohit. When we open up de novos, we focus on ABA and building that to begin with, building our ABA, our base of ABA clients for call it 6 months. And then we start introducing speech and OT. We might have a speech therapist or an occupational therapist come over a day a week or a couple days a week as we're starting to grow. And so they're splitting their time between multiple facilities, but we won't staff on a full-time basis until we've
That
grown
makes
to a
sense.
point where we can really support them. But it's also a matter of making sure that the ABA part of what we're doing is well functioning before we start trying to do more.
Got it. So when you think in terms of the person who has responsibility for the child, for the client, is that, or the quarterback, so to speak, is that person typically an ABA, the BCBA?
Yes,
Okay.
it is, which is creates a little bit of friction within
Hmm.
the organization because you have other licensed providers, the OTs and the SLPs, and
Yeah.
there's some view, including from one of the founders that I work with of one of the organizations that we run, and she's both an SLP and a BCBA, so she's licensed in both disciplines, and she believes that speech should be the quarterback for everything. I think just based on the number of hours of ABA that a child receives versus hours of
Right.
speech, it- from a practical standpoint, it's really hard to make the speech therapist the quarterback, and so we don't
Right.
try to do that.
Yeah.
But there are differing points of view on it, and our default is that it's more or less driven by ABA, but we're working really hard to ensure that there's a high degree of collaboration among all of the specialists and that the speech therapists are working directly with the BCBAs and even the RBTs to ensure that they're carrying through what the speech therapist is working on with the child in terms of their speech and language skills. I think that's where the value gets unlocked by having everybody
Mhm.
under one roof. That's where the clinical value gets unlocked. Obviously, for the families, there's the convenience value, but if we can unlock the clinical value by ensuring that there's a high degree of integration between the specialists, then boom, then I think we have a model that really benefits the child more than any other model that's out there.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. And I think you might have answered my 10th question, but I'll ask it anyway, which was about just is there an age group you focus on? Just the client demographics, primarily early learners or mixed stages? And
Like everybody, we're really interested in getting to the early learners because they're the ones that we can impact the most. And we can get them on the trajectory, like their best life trajectory as early as possible. And so everybody wants to be able to have that impact. But, but we will certainly take if an 8-year-old presents to us, they've been discharged from an ABC, for instance, because they've aged out, we will take them and we'll continue to work with them if it's clinically appropriate. Yep.
and so for a lot of organizations, you get a challenge where you get this like massive number of hours in the afternoon and relative paucity in the morning,
Right.
which is one really difficult from the point of view of hiring BTs. And second, it's hard to be productive and have better turnover in those situations. So how do you manage for that? So you have no shortage of kids, presumably, families that would be willing to take afternoon hours. Do you look for morning kids and then balance it with the afternoon kids, or is there an approach?
Well, we want to provide early intervention services, but we're not a one-size-fits-all organization. And there are some very large provider groups that do have a one-size-fits-all mentality. And is as long as I've heard of autism, I've always heard of people being on the spectrum, which means that it's not just a fixed point that every
Right,
child fits into, and yet a lot of providers pretend as if there's a fixed point, and they say every child between the ages of 2 and 5 need to get 40 hours a week, high
right,
intensity. The reality is that based on a variety of factors, a 3-year-old may most appropriately be receive 25 hours a week, whereas
right.
another 3-year-old may need 40 hours a week. And so you got to look at them as individuals. And I'm not sure, I think because of economic reasons, as well as a lack of maybe clinical awareness. I'm trying to choose my words carefully here, but
Right.
some organizations just use a one size fits all approach and they make a lot of money doing it. But from my perspective, and I'm getting to the answer to answer your question here, from my perspective, if we have a bunch of kids that receive 4, 5, 6 hours a day of therapy before the afternoon, the older kids come on in the afternoon, then we can actually create full-time jobs by matching a 5 hour a day, a 25 hour a week child that goes from 8 a.m. to whatever, 2 p.m. with
Right.
a child who comes on from 3 p.m. to 5 or 6 or whatever, a 10 or 15 hour a week kid. So it's very possible to make it all work if and provide like the optimal amount and quality of care with a highly nuanced model.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Do you have time for two more questions, really quick ones?
Sure. Yeah.
In-house diagnostics versus external partners.
We do in-house and we have
Mhm.
external partners. It depends on the region, but we do ASD testing in 4 or 5 different locations right now. We're going to be adding another couple locations. We do have neuropsychologists, PhD neuropsychologists who are part of our organization, and then a number of neuropsych techs who do a lot of the testing. They do a lot of the ADOS testing, and then the neuropsychologists are there to interpret and write the reports and everything. But honestly, most of our referrals, so more than half of our referrals come from outside our
Hmm.
organization. And frankly, even the testing that our neuropsychologists do, a lot of those families end up going to other providers just because of
Sure.
geography and
Yeah.
for other reasons, whatever their insurance coverage is. There's a multitude of reasons, but I like being able to provide the in-house testing.
And with regard to referrals from outside, is there a preference between digital marketing or diagnostic referrals?
Yeah, we
What
do it all.
you do it all?
We have a really strong marketing group. And so they do a lot of the digital, the online marketing and everything. But we also have people that, including our clinical directors, that spend time in the field and get to know our referring physicians really well. So pediatricians, developmental pediatricians, and others.
That's 12 questions, so two more than what I'd intended. Oh, claimed. So that's all I have. But are there any particular topics that you want to weigh in on that are close to your heart?
No, I think we've covered a really broad set of topics here. And I think the one thing that I keep coming back to is just that clinical care model and delivering, first of all, recommending the most appropriate amount of hours for a child based on the severity of their diagnosis and the quality of life in their home and
Yeah.
a number of factors their violence score. So I think you got to triangulate all of that and come up with the most appropriate recommendation. And it's not a one size fits all. But then the key is delivering a very high
Yeah.
percentage of that and being at the 90 or 95% level. So that's that is something I think about every single day.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. It's been a pleasure, Mark. I really appreciate your
Yeah, it's
time.
always
And
fun talking to you.
yeah, and I know this went a little longer than intended, but it was that good. All right. Hopefully we catch up sometime and have a beer or something.
For sure.